working. Hello, hello, hello. Is the mic on? Yeah, the mic is on. All right. Y'all ready to get started? I think it's about time. It's 9:35. Well, good morning. I'm Daniel Gillespie. Some of you may not know me. I think I've taught this particular class once before. I've taught the River Oaks College and Career class, the Through the Bible class a few times. Several of you know my wife Ashley, my three kids, James, Gwen, and Mary. I'm privileged to teach this class. I was excited when Kyle sort of had this idea to teach C.S. Lewis. In fact, I had some preparation to to give an apology for fiction, just a brief one, but I scratched that. I had lots of ideas about what to do today. In fact, in part because the great divorce is not the Bible. It is, for me, because I teach college English, sort of an odd thing. It's like I'm used to teaching the Bible in church. I'm used to teaching like Hamlet in college, but this is sort of blending my worlds. So anyway, I've focused some thoughts down. I don't know how far we're going to get. I've treated this preparation sort of, kind of, like I would treat an English class in a way. So I'm kind of assuming that a lot of you are familiar with this work. So who is? Can we get a show of hands? Okay, awesome. Maybe for those who are not familiar with the work, maybe what you hear this morning will encourage you to read it, right? I do think it's a worthwhile work to read. It is thought-provoking, at least. I remember, I guess it may have been like in May or June, where I was kind of reading this work, maybe for like the third time or so, and I was reading it to the family, and I was reading the chapter on the big man. And it's a powerful chapter. Maybe it's just me, I don't know, but I couldn't read it without tearing up. But then again, I tear up reading like a poem by Frost or something, so maybe that doesn't mean a lot. But I think if you read this carefully, it has a way of penetrating into some, oftentimes, sort of hidden places in our hearts, right? That maybe we've sort of keep locked away. I like to think of the Great Divorce. There's lots of ways you could think of this work, but one of the ways is a spiritual adventure. I think if you want to sort of frame this work under a kind of heading, that's not an unhelpful heading. It's an adventure, and it's fictional. So even though I know better, when I read this work, my mind wants to be like, well, does he want me to think heaven is like this? How should I read this? Does he think that when you die, these things actually happen? Because I don't think that's right. How should I read this? And so one helpful thing to do while you read this work is just to keep that idea in the forefront. This is not scripture. This is a fictional work. And with fiction, you have a lot of leverage, right? And so when you're reading someone like C.S. Lewis, you have to ask questions like, well, why does he portray heaven in this manner? If he doesn't actually think heaven is this way, what is the point? So a spiritual adventure, that's kind of how I like to think about it. He doesn't necessarily want us to gather our theology from this book entirely. I think C.S. Lewis may be not the best place to go for all of your theology. So it's not a theological textbook. Of course, it's not the Bible. So I thought we would just start by giving a very brief plot overview. In terms of plot, it's got more plot than the screw tape, but it's not I described it as an adventure, and I think that's true. But the plot of the novel is more predicated on what I call profiles. So a lot of the plot, sort of the action that's taking place, is front-loaded. So it's early on. And then once we're in heaven, the structure becomes something of a structure of profiles. So our protagonist, the narrator, is going to give us several profiles of certain characters. And that's where the real meat and potatoes are in the novel, is the profiles. So here, I've just got sort of a very, very brief plot synopsis here. So we encounter our narrator early on in the novel in what is known as the Gray Town, the Gray Town. We learn that time here in the Gray Town, we learned this from the narrator, seems to have paused. So in the Gray Town, time just seems to have been frozen here. It is always in what the narrator calls evening twilight. And with constant rain, the scenery of the town is quite unpleasant. The narrator finds himself waiting in line for a bus and eventually gets on with several other passengers. Surprisingly, the bus soars into the air and takes them all to the foothills of heaven. The mechanism of the bus and the plot reminds me of that PBS cartoon. What was that show? The Magic School Bus? Right. Our narrator comes to learn that everyone on the bus, including himself, are actually ghosts. Transparent, ghostly figures who find the reality of heaven's foothills incredibly hard, heavy, and altogether different than the Gray Town. There, in the foothills of heaven, the citizens of the Gray Town meet heavenly figures who come to assist them toward heaven proper, a city that resides beyond the foothills. The reality of heaven, with its hard grass, makes the environment inhospitable to the ghost. Yet the citizens of heaven explain that with their help, the newcomers will gradually gain the ability to walk pain-free and to enjoy the wonderful reality of heaven. We get a glimpse of many of these encounters. And like I said previously, I would like to think of these encounters as profiles. The real purpose behind these encounters is to give the reader a sense of what damns people to hell. Not so much the theological explanation, but the attitudes and words that represent a rejection of God. So a good writer, if you've ever taken like a creative writing class, they'll always tell you, the textbook will tell you, the professor will tell you, a good writer shows his audience, he doesn't always tell his audience. So if you want one of your characters in your short story or your novel, you want your readers to know he's angry, you don't say, oh yeah, and the guy in a gray hat was really angry. You have him do something, right? You have him throw a bottle across the room. You have him act it out. And so with that sort of logic in mind, this is what we get with Lewis. Like, what damns people to hell? The attitudes, the thought processes, the actions, the words, what it looks like, what it sounds like. We get those profiles here. The narrator, towards the end, I don't know if it's actually towards the end, but on into the novel, the narrator meets his mentor, George MacDonald, who was actually a source of inspiration for Lewis in real life. And George MacDonald plays the role of something like Virgil plays in Dante's Inferno. MacDonald offers insight and clarity to our protagonist. But by the end, and this is a very short and perhaps sloppy summary of the plot, but towards the end, or at the end, the narrator wakes up, and we discover it's all been a dream. I also thought about going into this whole thing about dream visions. There's a whole history behind this. It goes all the way back to Cicero, and you'll find it in people like Chaucer, and it's a whole thing. But I had a sneaking suspicion not everybody would be into that. So we're going to move on. What is it all about? What is this novel all about? What is Lewis up to? Well, in the preface, slide time. In the preface, we get a few words about the poet William Blake. And I'll read the quote to you here. I think it's on the slide too. Lewis writes, Blake wrote The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. If I have written of their divorce, this is not because I think myself a fit antagonist for so great a genius, nor even because I feel at all sure that I know what he meant. Kind of a jab there, I think. But in some sense or other, the attempt to, But in some sense or other, the attempt to make that marriage is perennial. In other words, it's always happening. This desire that Blake expresses to merge or to marry or to combine heaven and hell is not unique to Blake. It's not unique to any one particular individual. What does it mean for heaven and hell to be united? Ultimately, I think it means that there is no division. There's no division. It's sort of a broadly pantheistic idea. That in the end, all things will turn out to be somehow divine or good or okay. And as Christians, this should strike us as strange. I have a few scriptural references sort of sprinkled throughout here, but Matthew 25, the final judgment, we read in verse 31. Christ tells us, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. So those who imagine the marriage of heaven and hell must mean that there is no real heaven and no real hell, at least not as we conceive of them. I think I heard that in a song, right? John Lennon, Imagine All the People, right? Imagine there is no heaven. Well, this is something like that, but imagine that at the end, everything is good. Everything has a spark of the divine in it, right? To quote Blake, he says in one of his poems, he says, For everything that lives is holy. Everything. So this is part of what Lewis has in mind. He wants to make sure we understand there is a great separation, a great divide. In fact, this isn't just true of Blake's day, people wanting to merge these two categories. It wasn't just true in the author's day, it's true in our day too. The label of evil is reserved for a very select few. Perhaps not among us at church, but on the news, online, at work. There's only a few select people that people feel free to call evil. If you're old enough to remember, and I think the majority of us here are, to remember like 9/11, these are some of the instances in which people feel free to say, that is the face of evil. Right? But people like terrorists or historical figures like Hitler, right? These are those that are clearly evil. But in our culture, these particular individuals are something of an anomaly. That's how they're treated, at least. They're strange. They're extremes. They are exceptions to the rule. Everybody else is good, but that guy, right? As a general rule, our culture tells us that good is within us all. Just watch the latest Disney movie. They'll tell you that. The modern heart and mind have been seduced by our culture to lean in towards that ancient deception, which tells us that we are the arbiters of good and evil, that we can decide. In fact, C.S. Lewis points when he references the marriage of heaven and hell, our tendency to collapse the distinction. And the bad things people do out there, we grow to understand them as bad in the sense that they are not evil, but inconvenient. The violence we encounter, theft, all of these things, they're inconvenient. They complicate life. They hurt the economy. We even say that crimes like theft are the result of social conditions. This is the primary cause of them. The thief or the troublemaker isn't truly bad. He grew up in poverty. He had a hard time in school. And this kind of rhetoric must be the case in a secular liberal democracy, since all authority, at least in theory, rests on the people. What is good, what is bad, is ultimately what is popular. We are the arbiters of what should and shouldn't be. We have that voice. And when we come across someone who doesn't fit in the system, who's a bit of a troublemaker, we'll say, he's not evil. After all, he's from among us. They are somehow victims of society. The Great Divorce is predicated on the idea that there is a division. There's a gap. There's a dividing line. There's a day when the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father." A couple of themes I just jotted down here is that God and all that is good is real, like rocks. I think that's sort of a paraphrase of Peter Kreeft. They're real. He and all that he has for us are knowable, discoverable, they're good. What is right and good is not purely subjective. Evil, likewise, is not merely what I happen not to like. The nature of evil is defined in relation to what is true and good, not in relation to my personal taste or to my personal opinions. Good, to summarize Lewis, isn't the essential nature of everything. And one day we will come to see this hard and very real truth. I said earlier that the novel is or can be thought of as an adventure. And like most adventures, it starts in the middle of action, right? It just kind of throws you in there. And this is how the novel starts. I seem to be standing. Kind of an interesting start, right? Either you are or you're not. I seemed to be standing in a busy queue by the side of a long, mean street. Evening was just closing in, and it was raining. I had been wandering for hours in similar mean streets, always in the rain and always in evening twilight. Time seemed to have paused on that dismal moment when only a few shops have lit up, and it is not yet dark enough for their windows to look cheering. And just as the evening never advanced to night, so my walking had never brought me to the better parts of the town. However far I went, I found only dingy lodging houses, small tobacconists, hoardings from which posters hung in rags, windowless warehouses, goods stations without trains, and bookshops of the sort that sell the works of Aristotle. I never met anyone. Before the little crowd at the bus stop, the whole town seemed to be empty. I think that was why I attached myself to the queue. By the way, this is a kind of characterization of the protagonist, right? He's drawn to the crowd. If you read the novel, that's a good sign. That's a good sign, to be drawn to people. Soon after, we learn that our protagonist is in the afterlife. When that does become clear, if you read this at the beginning, it's not clear. But when it does become clear, we recall that the narrative starts like this. I seem to be standing in a busy queue by the side of the road. Also, at the very end, when you realize this has all been a dream, this line kind of comes back into your mind. I seemed. He tips his hand here a bit. We are in a dream. We are placed in a dream. One descriptor that occurs several times and that works to characterize the great town is the word empty. And a lot of it's cognates too. Like throughout the novel, there is this sort of overall theme of being empty or emptiness. Okay. The image of the town is quite realistic, but the key characteristic is that the town is empty, it is void. It does not represent the hustle and the bustle of a usual town. It is the town's emptiness that draws our narrator to the queue. And if you think of the word empty as emptiness, we begin to draw closer to what I think is one of the main points of the novel, emptiness as a lack of meaning. I think you will get a clear understanding of the horror of the town's physical emptiness if we associate it with what physical emptiness may point to, may symbolize. What does the emptiness mean? This idea works on the level of the townspeople being revealed later to be ghosts. They are insubstantial. They are devoid of real substance. They are empty. I think this definition of evil comes from St. Augustine or from a tradition that goes back to him. Evil is not a substantive entity or a separate force, but rather the absence of the good. Evil is not a substantive entity or a separate force, but rather the absence of the good. It's the absence of the good. This is a major theme in the novel. With this in mind, the good is experienced in this novel poetically as substance. So heaven is hard, it's sharp, it's heavy. In other words, poetically, it's good. And what is insubstantial, what is ghostly, by contrast, is bad. Evil, though it is real insofar as evil does exist, its ontology is not equivalent to the good. But rather, evil is dependent on the good. In other words, you can have good without evil, but not evil without good. You can have good without evil, but not evil without good. Yet there is a sense that evil, particularly in the gray town, is not in its final degraded form. The gray town, the twilight in the gray town, there's this suspension, right? And there's a rumor in the gray town that night is coming. Not everybody in the gray town believes this, but that's a rumor. Night, it's complete darkness. I ought to have gone to this slide, sorry. Night is complete darkness. Night would be something equivalent to evil's final form, a kind of nothingness, yet substantial enough to say it is. And I was reminded of Paradise Lost. If anyone's read Paradise Lost, this is a very famous line in Paradise Lost. This is after Satan has fallen down to hell, has been cast down to hell, and we're hearing the narrator sort of give an overview of what Satan is seeing for the first time. And so, what does he see? Well, at once, as far as angels ken, he views the dismal situation, waste and wild, a dungeon horrible on all sides round, as one great furnace flamed. Yet from those flames, no light, but rather darkness visible. I think that might be something of the gray town's final darkness, right? It's not that it's oblivion. It's not pure annihilation. But there is this poetic idea that darkness really will be the final form of evil. It's barely there at all. And again, at the very end of the novel, you'll see that most clearly. Early on, like in the first two chapters, we see the city, then the bus queue, then the interactions among the people. Lewis is careful to give us a very relatable circumstance. The hell we meet, the great town we meet, should strike us as very relatable. In fact, I want to point out a few passages that provide descriptions of the actual people our protagonist is around. When he finally gets on the bus, and even while they're in line for the bus, these are some of the people, some of the circumstances that characterize that. This is the protagonist speaking. He says, "I had a stroke of luck right away. For just as I took my stand, the little waspish woman who would have been ahead of me snapped out at a man who seemed to be with her. Very well then, I won't go at all. So there." And left the queue. "Pray, don't imagine," said the man in a very dignified voice, "that I care about going in the least. I've only been trying to please you for peace sake. My own feelings are, of course, a matter of no importance. I quite understand that. And suiting the action to the word, he also walked away. Come, thought I. That's 2 places gained. My fellow passengers fought like hens to get on board the bus, though there was plenty of room for us all. I was the last to get in. The bus was only half full, and I selected a seat at the back, well away from the others. You see the emphasis on space here, going back to that idea of emptiness. They're all just so eager to get on the bus, right? Elbowing each other and everything. For what? It's half empty. And even our protagonist says, he tried to be by himself. Once we learn that the great town is hell, it should strike us, it struck me, as peculiar. C.S. Lewis does not give us a picture of clearly demented, evil townspeople. He gives us rather ordinary people, husbands and wives. We see early on in the novel commonplace people and occurrences like the one you find on earth. Husbands and wives, public nuisances, young lovers. They're not obvious, crazy-eyed people, right? They're not obviously evil people. There's no obvious sign he is in hell, though later, of course, we do find out that he is. Part of the logic is to burst the notion that hell is for other people, that it is unimaginable, that it is practically unreal. He's trying to break that notion, right? He makes a great town ordinary, pedestrian, relatable. When I was in grad school and reading things like Paradise Lost, there was an author I came across by the name of Stanley Fish, and one of his books came out during a time, I think in the 1970s, in which there were 2 schools of thought on Paradise Lost. One school of thought said that Paradise Lost was basically in line with God. It was an epic poem celebrating the power of God, God's order, blah, blah, blah. There was another school of thought, however, that read Paradise Lost as something of framing the devil as the hero. That the devil was actually the one we root for. And so Stanley Fish comes in and says, let's see if we can't bridge these 2 schools. And in his work, Surprised by Sin, he argues the fact that the reason we side with the devil, in part, is because we're fallen. That the reason we have these 2 schools of thought is not that they're mutually exclusive, but rather they're coming from sort of the same psyche. They're coming from the same types of people. It's like, yes, it's obvious that God is the one who is over all, in charge in the poem, but at the same time, we're kind of sympathetic with the devil. And he says, yeah, because you're sinful. You're surprised by sin. You're like, oh, I did that? I'm rooting for him? Why is that? I think Lewis wants us to be surprised by hell. Once we realize the nature of the great town, we should think and say, wait a minute, that was too normal. Is hell an English town full of ordinary people? Well, no, but there is a correspondence between the world we know and hell. It is not that one is unreal and the other one is real. Both are real. It is not that hell is full of a handful of really, really bad folks. No, it is filled with neighbors, friends, families, co-workers, people like that. It's real. And we recognize realness, if you will, by way of the ordinary. I didn't come last week because I was under the weather, but Byron may have touched on this. But in the Screwtape Letters, do y'all remember that episode where Is the uncle Screwtape? Okay, all right. I always get that confused. Screwtape is telling Wormwood sort of how not to overreact to his patient. Like when he sees his patient is like in deep thought and God maybe is bringing things to him, don't panic. And so he gives this anecdote. He says, well, my patient, I believe it was the library he was in deep thought, and God was probably whispering things into his ear. He says, the frustrating thing is you can never quite tell what he's telling the patient. He says, but I think it was something serious. And so rather than saying, oh, no, don't think that, stop that. He says, yeah, that's very serious. In fact, it's so serious, you should pause and wait and go have lunch. This is too serious to think on an empty stomach. And so what does the patient do? He goes back outside, leaves the library, and as soon as he hears the traffic and voices, then Screwtape says, this is reality, right? What you see out here, what you were thinking in there is crazy. And he said, oh yeah, right. And I think this is sort of what Lewis is fighting here too. He says, hell is something we can sort of imagine as, yeah, I believe in it, but, it's kind of out there somewhere, and it's, right? And in our weak moments, we're tempted to sort of mythologize it. He says, no. Hell, the devil, and our own flesh work to normalize our depravity. They work to make sin comfortable. They work to make sin seemingly unavoidably expected and normal. With this in mind, I think Lewis's picture of hell is in many ways a picture of an ordinary day on earth. Our narrator does not know he is dead, or at least that's the impression you have of him. The people around him seemingly are unaware of their true state. Once we get to that Episcopal cleric that he meets in heaven, he's full of theological knowledge, but he's not even aware that when he was in the great town, he was in hell. And all seem to be completely unaware of where they actually are. Therefore, for all intents and purposes, it is earth until you realize it is not, right? There is this sort of in-between state that you have going on. The nature of hell in this way points back to the dream frame. After all, we are in a dream. Are we in hell? Well, yes, the great town is hell. But the nature of hell is akin to earth in so many ways. Are we actually in heaven when we actually get to heaven? Yes, but only in its lower state, only in its foyer, only in the foothills. The state is something of an in-between state in both cases. We're not alive on earth, yet not fully in heaven or in its fullest reality of hell. There's still kind of a future we're looking forward to in each case. Sleep, as we know, our narrator is actually sleeping. Sleep itself is something of an in-between state, right? In each case, the horrors of hell and the pleasures of heaven are still something in the future. In a certain sense, this situation is very much like life before death. This familiar sense allows us to appreciate the people on the bus. Yeah, that's how I read this a bit. Rather than reading this as sort of this description of what heaven is actually like, or what hell is actually like, to fit it more within my theological frame, I kind of see this as like everyday life almost, right? So when you read these profiles of people, it's almost like you could be having these conversations with people at work, or you could be having these conversations with people in your neighborhood. One characteristic of the people on the bus is their annoyance at others. They desire for room and they desire isolation. We even come to know that one of the characteristics of the great town is the distance between people. On the bus, the narrator meets someone he calls an intelligent-looking man who gives a glimpse of the true conditions of the great town. It's kind of eerie. He says, the trouble is that they're so quarrelsome, the citizens of the great town. As soon as anyone arrives, he settles in some street. Before he's been there 24 hours, he quarrels with his neighbor. Before the week is over, he's quarreled so badly that he decides to move. Very like he finds the next street empty because all the people there have quarreled with their neighbors and moved. So he settles in. If by any chance the street is full, he goes further. But even if he stays, it makes no odds. He's sure to have another quarrel pretty soon, and then he'll move on again. Finally, he'll move right out to the edge of the town and build a new house. You see, it's easy here. You've only got to think a house. And there it is. That's how the town keeps on growing, leaving more and more empty streets. That's right. And time's sort of odd here. That place where we caught the bus is thousands of miles from the civic center where all the newcomers arrive from Earth. All the people you've met were living near the bus stop. But they've taken centuries of our time to get there by gradual removals. You just have to think, it's there. So they have the freedom to keep moving further. And there's people just light years away from the bus terminal, right? It's just frightening. Their sense of annoyance and their sense of not being able to get along just makes them move further and further and further and further apart. We know from Aristotle, from his Politics, or we have this quote from Aristotle from his Politics. He says, he who is unable to live in society, or who has no need because he is sufficient for himself, must be either a beast or a god. If you don't need other people, you're either an animal or a god. You need other people. We know from Scripture that it's not good for man to be alone. But what is the impulse of these people? What drives them? Privacy, isolation. Everyone seems to one degree or another in the great town to be controlled by a self-centered attitude that expresses a degree of antisocial tendencies, right? So there's this critique here that C.S. Lewis has of individualism, or a expression or a kind of individualism here. Individualism, of course, is beautiful in the context of a person becoming that for which he was created. It is horrifying when individualism is understood as a person separated from any ultimate object or aim, except perhaps their own personal happiness. This particular individual is individuated in the sense that he is isolated from all that might conform him to that which he was originally designed to be. The result Lewis represents as a horror which only the light of heaven truly reveals. In fact, as they approach heaven on the bus, as they get closer to it, and the light of heaven starts coming through the bus, the windows in the bus, he says, I glanced around the bus. Though the windows were closed and soon muffed, the bus was full of light. It was cruel light. I shrank from the faces and forms by which I was surrounded. They were all fixed faces, full not of possibilities, but of impossibilities. Some gaunt, some bloated, some glaring with idiotic ferocity, some drowned beyond recovery in dreams, but all in one way or another distorted and faded. One had a feeling that they might fall to pieces at any moment if the light grew much stronger. I gasped when I saw them. Now that they were in the light, they were transparent, fully transparent when they stood between me and it. I believe it there is the bus. Smudgy and imperfectly opaque when they stood in the shadow of some tree. They were in fact ghosts, man-shaped stains on the brightness of that air. One could attend to them or ignore them at will, as you do with the dirt on a window pane. I noticed that the grass did not bend under their feet. Even the dewdrops were not disturbed. From what we know of these people from chapters 1 through 2, their physical appearance seems to match their inner character. They're petty, they're prideful, they're quick to anger, they're foolish, they're worldly, and so on. I'm running out of time. We can touch on the big man. Give him like 5 minutes. Then we'll just pick up. I told you, I don't know where I was going to end here. Let's look at the big man here. And I've given you a handout. We're probably not going to get to that handout, so just don't. How about this? Don't keep it. Just put it back on the table. You have a better chance of keeping it up if I have it at the table. The big man. He is a violent and self-professedly plain man who wants only his basic rights, same as anyone else. He's willing to punch someone and injure them for simply speaking in a way that does not suit him. But don't worry about that. He's only standing up to bullies, only defending himself and his rights. You can imagine that this guy knows exactly what is right and wrong. He can smell a bad deal a mile away. He has a gut instinct about everything and anything. And if you disagree or happen to say the wrong thing at the wrong time, well, you're simply asking for it. You're in the wrong, because after all, he's just a plain man who wants his rights, the same as everybody else. If you've read about the big man, you know these are quotes, right? I'm just a plain man. I just want my rights. Want to talk about something serious that goes beyond common sense? Don't do it around him. He'll tell you that you're full of nonsense and the type of person who would get people worrying about a lot of foolishness. You better stick to what makes sense, what's plain, what respects others' basic rights, and so on around him. It reminded me of the book, What's Wrong with the World by G.K. Chesterton. He has, I don't think I have this on the slide, but he says, there has arisen in our time a most singular fancy, the fancy that when things go very wrong, we need a practical man. Who hasn't heard that? It would be far truer to say that when things go very wrong, we need an unpractical man. Certainly, at least, we need a theorist. A practical man means a man accustomed to mere daily practice, to the way things commonly work. When things will not work, you must have the thinker, the man who has some doctrine about why they work at all. But the big man, he'll have none of that foolishness. The big man is more than an individual character. He's a type. And we've all probably come across him. He's a character in the novel, for sure. He's a he's not really flesh and blood character, is he? He's a ghostly character in the novel, but he also stands for 1,000 other characters of whom you know, some of whom may be your neighbor. By the way, what the big man means by plain, what he means by common sense, means what comports with his desires, what he thinks is right, his opinions. Look at your hand up for like 2 minutes. I think it begins with almost at once I was followed by what I've called the big man. To speak more accurately, the big ghost. And you will notice the change here, right? Big man, big ghost. He, in his turn, was followed by one of the bright people. "Don't you know me?" he shouted to the ghost. And I found it impossible not to turn and attend. The face of the solid spirit. He was one of those that wore a robe, made me want to dance. It was so jocund, so established in its youthfulness. "Well, I'm damned," said the ghost. "I wouldn't have believed it. It's a fair knockout. It isn't right, Lynn, you know. What about poor Jack, eh? You look pretty pleased with yourself. But what I say is, what about poor Jack?" Notice what the big ghost doesn't say. "Wow, look at where we are. I can't believe you're here. Look at you." Right? There's no sense of surprise or astonishment. So what about poor Jack? "Well, who's Jack? Let's continue." "He is here," said the other. "You will meet him soon, if you stay." "But you murdered him." "Of course I did. It's all right now." "All right, is it? All right for you, you mean. But what about the poor chap himself, laying cold and dead?" Notice his inability to think ahead or to move beyond, right? His imagination, in terms of poor Jack, is still in the past. And this is a big theme in the novel, in these profiles. Many, if not all of these characters are sort of stuck. They can't look beyond themselves. They can't look ahead. But he isn't. I've told you, you will meet him soon. He sent you his love. What I'd like to understand, said the ghost, is what you're here for, as pleased as punch. You, a bloody murderer. Well, I've been walking the streets down there, living in a place like a pigsty all these years. That is a little hard to understand at first, but it is all over now. You will be pleased about it presently. Till then, there's no need to bother about it. No need to bother about it. Aren't you ashamed of yourself? No, not as you mean. I do not look at myself. I have given up myself. I had to, after the murder. That was what did it for me. And that was how everything began. Now, here is one of the major themes of the book. And we hear it from this man. I do not look at myself. Yet he is one of the solid ones. Right? He's one of the solid ones. He's worth looking at, so to speak. And the big ghost, ironically, he can only see himself, even though he is transparent and ghostly and insubstantial. We'll leave it there for this morning. Do you mind if I pray for us before we head out? Heavenly Father, we do thank you for the genius that you gave your servant C.S. Lewis, and we thank you, Father, even more for your truth, your word. We do thank you that it is you who has the power to call good what is good. You have the power to call evil, evil. And Lord, you have called us to yourself, and we here ask that you renew our hearts and our minds with a desire for the good, for what is true and good. And as we head to worship, Father, may our hearts and may our minds be focused on that in a fresh way, so that we may be pleasing to you. And we ask this in his name, in Christ's name. Amen.